I don't remember how I came across your work, but it was probably a decade ago, was the book,
Yes,
right? Precursor to this current volume.
for sure.
So, you were way ahead of your time in terms of the advocacy. What triggered this passion of yours?
Okay, I'm going to give you the short version of that because it's not really that important. My first chiropractic practice in the United States was in California. I began noticing that you can adjust people's spine and biomechanically align them and take away the subluxations. But as time went on, they were still getting sicker, and there were other elements of health besides just a straight spine, even though subluxation removal is critical for complete health, in my opinion. But there's still other factors involved, diet, nutrition, lifestyle. And that's when I got into that whole line of inquiry. And I started out really with the effect of pharmaceutical drugs as a handicap to getting people back to normal health. I started out with antibiotics. The very first one was the Post Antibiotic Age. And I did a very thorough study of antibiotics, beginning with the history of antibiotics. From penicillin was really the miracle cure. For one time in their history, the medical profession actually did pull the rabbit out of the hat, and that was really a significant discovery. But Fleming said he foresaw that we were going to be taking antibiotics like M&Ms, and he predicted the whole superbugs and antibiotic resistance scenario. He predicted that, and we're living through that. We're almost coming out the other side of it now, because even when you go to Kaiser these days, you have a cold, it's usually viral. You have the flu, it's definitely viral. And antibiotics aren't going to really do anything for that, but they do have negative effects. They're going to create resistance in you. So in the future, if you do have a life-threatening illness and need antibiotics to save your life, they won't work very well because you've built up this resistance. So that whole scenario, he predicted it. And now we didn't listen to him. We had to suffer through it. Anyway, that was the first chapter that I wrote. It's still there, the Post-Antibiotic Age. And then it just occurred to me, I wonder if this same type of disinformation could have been established in the field of vaccines as well. The first book I read, I remember, was a book by Walleen James entitled The Reality Behind the Myth, by Walleen James. That really opened my eyes. I read all her references, I read those references, and soon it was this interlocking body of information about vaccines. And that was, then at that time I wrote the first version of this book, Vaccination is Not Immunization. Since that time there have been about 16 or 17 different editions of it, but each one is a complete rewrite. I rewrite it almost every year in order to keep it current, because in the last 15 years, as you know, the whole field of vaccines, well, here's just one little statistic economically. In 1993, we spent $3 billion on vaccines in the entire world. Today, we are in excess of $50 billion spent on vaccines globally. In the 90s, kids only got, if you were taking your kid in for shot day and he got all his vaccines, by the time he was 18, he got 40 vaccines. And as you probably know from reading my book, today a child who receives all the vaccines on shot day, by the time he's 18, he will get 69 vaccines, and it's not even going to stop there. It's going to continue. They have plans for more. So that just gives you a little glimpse into it.
By the time they came up with the vaccination, whatever they were vaccinating was already kind of on the wane. Right?
Yes.
So help me review that a little bit.
It's individual charts for each disease, like measles, like diphtheria, like pertussis, like DPT vaccine. The present version of this book is called Vaccination is Not Immunization, The War on Children. That's the current edition of this book. And I discovered that, and I have all the documentation to prove this, from the real science, the real scientists who created vaccines. I traced the decline of each individual disease since 1900. the decline, how many people died, the incidence of each disease, and it turns out by the time the individual vaccines came out for each individual disease, that disease had declined in the United States by about 95%. And so the sales mantra of the vaccine industry was always, you must take your child in for vaccines. Vaccines have saved us from the scourge of this disease. If you don't vaccinate your child, these diseases will come back. Well, that's obviously not true according to their own literature, but they don't read their own literature. Any vaccine for any specific disease came out, that disease had already phased itself out by 95%. And I have all the documentation for that in your textbook.
So what is natural immunity and how is it different from a vaccine?
Okay. Natural immunity is something your body does. It creates immunity in you. It's the only way that humans have become immune to anything in history. Vaccines had nothing to do with it. Let's give an example. The bubonic plague, the Black Death in Europe, killed hundreds of thousands of people. Not tens of millions like they said, but definitely hundreds of thousands. Okay, there were no drugs. They thought it was evil spirits or retribution for evil deeds that was causing that. And what happened? Well, it burned its way through the population. The strong survived, just like Darwin said. And the ones who got smallpox, the ones who got bubonic plague and survived, they had built a natural immunity. They could be exposed to it. They could walk into a whole room of people who had those diseases and be completely immune. Let's give an example closer to home for most people. When you were a kid, Michael, you probably had measles? Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, and you were sick a little bit for a few days and then you got better. And now you have natural immunity to measles. Your body has put together the steps of immunity, creating resistance against that disease, which is going to last for the rest of your life. The problem is that medical science has only fragmented information about how that really takes place. We don't really understand how that happens. The real scientists will admit that. Only the salesmen, who are generally the pediatricians, do not acknowledge that. Natural immunity is something that has nothing to do with the vaccines. There's only one way for natural immunity to take place. You must either get the disease or be exposed to the disease, and then your body puts together the steps of immunity. That's natural immunity. Now, let's talk about artificial immunity. Should I make that contrast then?
Yes, please.